Look how smart I am.
Freshman, okay.
My middle daughter, just a year younger, is a communist.
Oh, sure, of course. That's how we all start, right? Oh, gosh, Brad.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and good morning. The Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia of the Foreign Affairs Committee will come to order. The audience is reminded that any disruptions will result upon a gavel of the suspension of anyone who disrupts the meeting, and the Capitol Police will remove anyone who disrupts the meeting. With that in mind, the purpose of the hearing is to discuss the President's fiscal year 2025 budget request for the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs and USAID, which we all appreciate, both bipartisan. With this in mind, I now recognize myself for an opening statement. The last few years have seen monumental events and shifts in the Middle East and North Africa. The historic Abraham Accords were a tremendous accomplishment by the Trump administration toward a stable and prosperous Middle East. With our allies and partners, there was tremendous progress toward normalization and extraordinary prosperity. Those partnerships have never been more critical. On October 7, 2023, the world watched as Iranian terrorist puppet Hamas murderously slaughtered Israeli citizens. Hamas perpetrated the largest single attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. War criminal Putin, the Chinese Communist Party, and the terrorist regime in Tehran have escalated their common goals, the destruction of democracy around the world. This new axis of evil has worked to undermine global security by stealing critical natural resources, disrupting global supply chains, and as we've seen by the Houthi attacks of shipping lanes, they face sadly minimal consequences. Yet this administration has not shown the necessary leadership to get the world through the crisis, much less reestablish deterrence, which is so critical of our adversaries. Sadly, the President pausing at least one and threatening to delay more critical weapons shipments to Israel is a sad example. Instead of ensuring Israel has the tools it needs to eliminate the threat of the Hamas terrorists, this administration prioritized the construction of an unnecessary pier in Gaza that, according to the Department of Defense, isn't even helping aid the people in need. America needs a clear and consistent policy from the United States to counter the Iranian-backed terrorist puppets and the proliferation of missiles and weaponized drones. This policy must include strengthening regional air and maritime defense cooperation and fulfilling arms sales with related security agreements without delay to ensure our partners and allies' security needs are fully met. The intentions of Hamas are extremely clear. They made it very clear in the goals of their charter of August 18, 1988, and I quote, Article 7, "The day of judgment will not come until the Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews. Then the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will result into the last Jew behind a rock come and kill him." End of quote. This administration has led countries across the region to question America's longtime commitments to the region. The United States leadership vacuum was publicly underscored by the recent murder of 3 American troops, Sergeant William Jerome Rivers, Specialist Kennedy Layden Sanders, and Specialist Breonna Alexandra Moffett, when the Iranian puppet Hezbollah killed American citizens. Sadly, the administration chose to half-heartedly, if at all, to respond. And I particularly identify these are Army reservists from my neighboring state of Georgia, and I served in the reserve myself. And it's just horrifying to think that 3 persons were killed by Hezbollah and 40 others were injured. The American people deserve better than this when we continue the pattern of the administration. And just this week, I was grateful to have a phone call with the very dedicated and dynamic family of the late Dr. Kamal Maz, Dr. Kamal Maz was an American psychologist who was murdered by the criminal Assad regime in Syria after being kidnapped by the regime in 2017. This administration has not made any statement of condolence or condemnation of the criminal Assad regime for killing a Syrian-American citizen. But sadly, the administration did issue condolences for Ibrahim Raisi, the butcher of Tehran, who was single-handedly responsible for the murder of tens of thousands of Iranian civilians. This juxtaposition clearly shows where the administration has chosen to side, unfortunately, with dictators. It's time to reevaluate the U.S. relationship with Iraq. The Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces are working against the best interests of the United States and democracy. I am grateful to have had an amendment to the NDAA yesterday on this topic, designating a report on the malign influence of the PMF and their collaboration with the regime in Tehran. I'm grateful that my two oldest sons, Alan and Addison, have served in Iraq to liberate the people of Iraq, and so I have, again, a special interest for the people of Iraq that they have a bright future, and it can't be with the Iranian influence. Finally, the United States continues to be the most generous nation in the world with regard to international aid. However, the weaponization of international aid through diversion by dictators and terrorists is a widespread problem that must be confronted. Steps must be taken to ensure aid is not diverted to dictators and reaches organizations such as the White Helmets, which actually work to help the people of Syria. I'm grateful that my amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act yesterday passed unanimously to prevent normalization of the mass murderer Assad. The world is currently engaged in a global conflict that we did not choose. Dictators with rule of gun on one side, beginning with the invasion February 24, 2023 by war criminal Putin, and democracy and rule of law on the other. Today, all eyes are on the Middle East, and we look forward to hearing from you how you plan to promote peace through strength and budget for the year. Thank you, witnesses, for your time. And now I'm so grateful we have with us today, back in his rightful place, the ranking member of the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Dean Phillips, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the kind words and your leadership. And just a reminder to all of us and all of you and anybody who might be watching that this is a committee dedicated to diplomacy and to peace, not to war. We are here to identify tactics, provide resources, inspiration, and strategies to end bloodshed. And I know I speak for every single one of my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, when I say that any child in this world, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, agnostic, who loses a life in war is one child too many. I want to thank Assistant Secretary Leaf and Deputy Assistant Administrator Pryor for being with us today. And clearly the world has changed considerably since our last hearing less than a year ago. Discussion about strengthening U.S. engagement in the Middle East, countering Russian and Chinese influence in the region, and promoting regional integration and economic growth have been supplanted by the appalling bloodshed in both Israel and Gaza. The Hamas terror attack of October 7th claimed 1,200 Israeli lives and 253 hostages, including Americans. I want to reiterate that. Americans continue to be held hostage in Gaza by a terror organization, with approximately 134 remaining in captivity today. And many of the women and girls killed or held captive have been subject to the most incomprehensible, disgusting sexual violence imaginable at the hands of Hamas terrorists. There's not a single nation in the entire world that would not have responded by aggressively targeting the elimination of Hamas, along with its key sponsor, the Iranian regime, are the most destructive and destabilizing elements in the entire Middle East. Israel has justifiably declared war on Hamas, not the Palestinian people. Hamas has sworn to the destruction of Israel. They are cowards who use women and children as human shields. They are cowards who hide in tunnels, thousands of miles of tunnels, under dense population centers. And they are cowards who operate and headquarter in hospitals and schools. In the 8 months since October 7th, the United Nations estimates that over 35,000 human beings have been killed in Gaza. While many thousands are clearly Hamas terrorists, there is no denying the loss of thousands of innocent lives in Gaza and near famine conditions that are currently ravaging the population. Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government have a responsibility to ensure increased humanitarian aid reaches Palestinian civilians unimpeded, and that all operations to eliminate Hamas terrorists are conducted in accordance with international humanitarian law. And when violations and tragedies occur, such as the strike on the World Central Kitchen employees, it is Israel's responsibility to fully and comprehensively investigate such incidents and hold individuals accountable. Let me be clear, I am deeply, deeply concerned about the Israeli government's failure to present a credible and actionable strategy to ensure the durable elimination of Hamas, the return of all hostages, and to enable, finally, Palestinian self-governance and security. It has become clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to be more focused on preserving his own position of power and short-term political advantages over the long-term security and prosperity of both Palestinians and Israelis alike. So we find ourselves at yet another critical juncture. During last year's hearing, we spoke about the extraordinary possibility of a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement, which, despite this crisis, still remains a possibility, contingent, and I repeat, contingent on Israel and the Arab world taking the courageous steps necessary to realize it. And while Gaza remains front and center, we mustn't forget Hezbollah, continuing to violate UN Security Council Resolution 1701 by launching thousands of missiles and rockets towards Israel's population centers. We mustn't forget the Houthis in Yemen, who continue to attack commercial and military vessels in the Red Sea, having done so over 68 times, while preventing assistance from reaching Yemeni civilians, half of whom desperately need humanitarian aid. And we mustn't forget the millions of displaced people and refugees desperate for the same thing that every single one of us in this room take for granted: a roof over our heads, food on the table for our children, and a future of possibility. The Near East Affairs budget must reflect the acute needs of the region while affording your agencies the ability and the flexibility to effectively respond to these challenges. I am pleased that Congress finally came together to pass the National Security Supplemental Bill, which included $8.7 billion in military aid and defense assistance to Israel and $9 billion in global humanitarian aid, much of which will be deployed to Gaza. I also urge your continued focus on repatriation and reintegration efforts for ISIS families in refugee camps like Al Hol and Raj in northeast Syria, and your commitment to working to address the humanitarian and security conditions inside those camps. We also must address democratic backsliding in Tunisia and push back against President Said's authoritarian rule and his continued destruction of institutional checks and balances, arrests and targeting of political adversaries, and silencing of the media and civil society. And finally, we must continue to encourage the selection of a Lebanese president, long overdue, who can unite the country, promote transparency and accountability, and finally put the interests of the Lebanese people above individual enrichment and outside influence. Lebanon is facing a horrific economic crisis, a refugee crisis, and a Hezbollah crisis. We cannot address these things without a legitimate government in place. Most of all, thank you to both of you, our witnesses, to your teams, for all the extraordinary work that you do every day on behalf of the United States of America and humanity. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
And indeed, thank you, Congressman Dean Phillips. And it's somewhat sad we're in the final months of Congressman Phillips serving in Congress. He's going on to bigger and better things in the future, but he shall be missed. But you can tell his passion and his background is so appreciated in a bipartisan way. We are pleased to have as distinguished witnesses today the Honorable Barbara A. Leaf, the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the Department of State, and Ms. Jeannie Pryor, the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of the Middle East at USAID. We want to thank you for being here today, and your full statements will be made part of the record, and we will keep the spoken remarks to 5 minutes in time so that we have time for members to ask questions. And I now recognize Assistant Secretary Leaf for the opening statement.
Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Phillips, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to testify on the President's FY 2025 budget request for the Middle East and North Africa, which remains a region which remains of vital importance to U.S. interests. While the Israel-Hamas conflict and escalation by Iran and its proxies complicate our work, the administration is fully committed to leading the collective action necessary for a secure and stable region responsive to the needs of its people. Diplomacy is the best means to address the issues at hand, and your support will undergird our vigorous diplomatic engagements to advance U.S. interests and contest strategic competitors seeking to exploit post-October 7th instability. Our regional engagement is anchored by a resolute effort to reinforce our partnerships as they are tested by conflict. We're committed to building enduring peace and security for and between Israelis and Palestinians, including through eventual steps to establish a Palestinian state existing side by side with Israel. Our FY 2025 request includes crucial life-saving aid for Palestinians in Gaza, as well as millions of refugees and internally displaced persons in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Yemen. Our unrivaled network of partnerships, including those forged through the Abraham Accords, creates integrated defense and deterrence to counter malign actors. Israel, with the help of the United States and a network of our allies, was able to defend itself from Iran's unprecedented missile and drone attack. To hold Iran accountable, we engaged with EU partners to secure expansion of sanctions authorities and work jointly with the G7 and others to impose sanctions. Our regional partners play an important role in ensuring regional stability and security. Egypt remains a critical partner for addressing the Israel-Hamas conflict and preventing regional spillover. It serves as a key staging ground and entry point for humanitarian aid and as a throughput for those evacuating Gaza. With Qatar, Egypt is indispensable to our efforts to secure the release of hostages. Jordan has also played a leading role in promoting peace and security in the region, and that cooperation remains critical to our own security priorities. In 2022, we signed the 7-year MOU on assistance. Jordan is making progress towards its benchmarks, and we will be with them every step of the way to implement them. Diplomatic engagement and solutions that build resilient institutions are the only viable paths towards restoring and maintaining stability in the region. Diplomacy can allow Lebanese and Israeli civilians on both sides of the blue line to return home. Our support enables the Lebanese armed forces to provide stability and security for those living on both sides of the blue line. We were grateful for the role they played protecting our embassy perimeter in Beirut during violent protests last October. Our request also calibrates support for the Tunisian people and to address their needs in an increasingly forbidding environment. Targeted U.S. investments have promoted professionalism and accountability within the Tunisian armed forces and counter strategic competitors attempting to gain influence by exploiting Tunisia's current security challenges. Your support for the department's plans to establish an interim diplomatic facility in Libya allows us to scale up our diplomacy amid an intensification of Russia's destabilizing influence. Libya's funding under the Global Fragility Act and our $19.25 million in bilateral assistance request supports Libya's eventual transition to a democratic, stable, and unified state. We seek a durable resolution to the conflict in Yemen through an inclusive peace process under UN auspices. Reckless Houthi attacks in the Red Sea threaten the regional and global economy and undermine those prospects. The $41.6 million in Yemen request advances our priorities of lasting peace in Yemen and economic security for the Yemeni people. Our commitment to greater regional stability includes the enduring defeat of ISIS, which continues to pose a resilient threat. With funds raised through the coalition and continued support of Congress, we can address and resettle families from El Hol and Roj camps and provide stabilization to foster resilience in local communities. A key U.S. priority is fostering a stable and sovereign Iraq, integrated regionally and with the global economic system. Our work with Iraq to diversify and grow its economy and develop real energy independence helps the Sudani government deliver better opportunities for the Iraqi people, and that includes an inclusive state for Iraq's religious and ethnic minorities. While events in the last year have injected dramatic dynamics into the Middle East and North Africa, our commitment to the region remains steadfast. The department is committed to supporting our partners, working together to address shared challenges. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the President's budget request, And I want to close by thanking the subcommittee for your continued support for our efforts in the region. And I want to give a shout out to my staff in the field and the staff in the NEA Bureau who've helped me prepare for this today.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Leaf. And we now recognize Deputy Assistant Administrator Pryor for your opening statement.
Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Phillips, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here to testify today at this incredibly difficult time in our region. We all know that the Middle East and North Africa are at a critical inflection point. Hamas's abhorrent attack on Israel and the ongoing conflict in Gaza have taken center stage across the globe. The challenges of the moment offer an opportunity in which the relatively modest amounts in our fiscal year 2025 request might play an outsized role in shaping a peaceful and prosperous future for the region. While we remain focused on the immediate response, we must also examine the entire scope of the region's challenges in order to envision a path forward. Water and food insecurity, high numbers of displaced persons from conflicts and natural disasters, corruption and economic mismanagement already strained the region's resources prior to October 7th. The region's fragile economies have been further set behind by the ongoing violence. Palestinian gross domestic product in 2023 declined by $1 billion compared with 2022, all of that in the fourth quarter. And earlier this year, the International Monetary Fund lowered its growth forecast for the region to 2%, significantly below the 5.6% growth seen in 2022. Despite the difficulties of this moment, Hamas's horrific attack makes clear the high costs of yielding the competition for the region's future, not only for the United States, but also for our regional allies. Our fiscal year 2025 request proposes critical investments to address the region's needs. In response to the conflict, we have requested an increase of $10.3 million to mitigate post-conflict needs in Gaza and the West Bank, and $5 million for Lebanon. We've also requested an $11 million increase in funding to support Morocco's recovery from last year's earthquake, and an additional $22 million in Syria to reintegrate returnees from Al-Hol into their communities. We will use these increases and our other requested investments to build on our previous accomplishments. For example, just this month, USAID supported the departure of 66 families from Al-Hol camp to Deir ez-Zor Governorate, where we are supporting them and their communities with legal assistance, transitional shelter, psychosocial support, and job opportunities. And just this week in Morocco, Administrator Samantha Power announced our partnership with the government of Morocco and an NGO to give direct cash grants to 180 cooperatives whose livelihoods were compromised by the earthquake. Our peace-building work deserves particular attention given the growing divisions in the region. Although tensions remain high, we continue to see signs of hope in the dedicated peace builders in the region. Our partners through the Nita M. Lowy Middle East Partnership for Peace Act remain committed to their work, and our Middle East Regional Cooperation Program has likewise seen positive signals for continued cross-border collaboration from its participants. Proposals for collaboration between Palestinian and Israeli researchers remain among the top proposed Merck partnerships. Our fiscal year 2025 request continues funding for these critical activities to continue the work of building enduring peaceful ties between Israel and its neighbors. Despite the numerous regional challenges, space remains to influence the trajectory of the region. The region's young population will play a critical role in shaping their future. We must invest in helping these young people develop a Middle East and North African region that is integrated into the global economy. With the funds requested, we will not only empower the people of the Middle East and North Africa to forge a more promising and prosperous future, but also ensure security for America and its allies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pryor. And I now recognize Congressman Brian Mast, and I want to thank him. At our last hearing, he showed his resolve. He stayed hour after hour after hour, and then was the last person to be able to ask a question. So today, the last shall go first. Congressman Brian Mast.
I'll take your word on that, Chairman. Thank you. Thank you both for your testimony today. I've reviewed your testimonies prior to your attendance today.
Secretary Leaf, my questions are primarily for you. Having reviewed your testimony, your request for budget, the discussion of post-conflict needs in Gaza, what you're requesting there, and specifically your statement in your written testimony about a two-state solution is the best way to ensure Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state living in peace alongside a viable, sovereign, and democratic Palestinian state as part of your testimony. It's fair to say you're the chief diplomat for America over the Mideast, the top dog, as they say. That would be a fair categorization of yourself? Yes. Yes, ma'am. And turn your microphone on so everybody can hear you. Very good. So my first question, I've asked this of others before, have you objectively assessed your pursuit of a Palestinian state?
So, Congressman, when have I objectively assessed it, meaning are the conditions there right now? They're not right there.
Did you
They're not there.
objectively, do you just decide, hey, I think there should be a Palestinian state? Or did you objectively look at this?
Longstanding policy, and it's certainly been the stated policy of this
But did
administration.
you personally, as the top dog over the Middle East, objectively assess whether we should make a state out of a group that currently holds 5 Americans hostage, roughly 5 Americans hostage, killed 35 Americans in the last couple months? Did you objectively assess?
So, Congressman, we have no intention of working with Hamas in that endeavor. What we're talking about is something entirely different.
I would hope you don't.
Yes.
So let me ask a question related to that. But you did objectively assess this?
Yes.
Okay, who did you objectively assess would become the leader of the Palestinian state that you wish to create?
It's not for us to designate a leader.
But if you are objectively assessing whether the United States of America should put resources into creating a Palestinian state, as the top diplomat over the Middle East, we would expect that you objectively assessed who would become the leader of this state.
No, it is not for us to determine that.
I didn't say you're going to determine it. I said, who do you objectively assess will be the leader of that?
I don't have an objective assessment as to who will be the leader.
So you
for
did
that.
not objectively assess who would
That's not
become the
part of the-
leader of the state that you wish to make?
No,
So you don't assess, well, maybe you can do it right now. Would you assess that Hamas would be the leader of that state?
absolutely not.
Palestinian Islamic Jihad?
Absolutely not.
Fatah?
Fatah is not the leader of anything right now.
I'm
It is
asking
a
you
po-
if you assess.
Fatah is an organization. It's a political organization.
Al-Aqsa
It's one of
Martyrs
a number.
Brigade.
No, absolutely.
Lion's Den.
Any of the FTOs, any of the organizations that we have designated as foreign terrorist organizations are exactly that. That is not what we're talking about.
But certainly, as you being our top diplomat in the area, you should be able to understand that we should have every expectation that if you're pursuing creating a Palestinian state, that you would have objectively assessed who you think would be the leader of that. Now, let me ask you something else. Do you objectively assess that if they were made a state today, that they would have to be labeled a state sponsor of terror?
Who is the they in that question?
A Palestinian state. Were a Palestinian state created prior to October 7, would it be a state sponsor of terror today?
It's a theoretical question I can't answer.
Would you label them a state sponsor of terror
A
today?
theoretical question.
Now you're just acting like
Especially one
people
in
do
the
in
past.
DC. Would you label them a state sponsor? Do they meet the
Who is the they?
requirements? Well, their government is Hamas.
No, if you're talking about Hamas, I've already answered that question.
But that
They
is their
are
government.
No, but we're not talking about Gaza. We're talking about a Palestinian state, and that's a larger question, and it would be a negotiated process.
Who would negotiate that?
The U.S. would offer its good offices to negotiate between the parties.
So we would negotiate it, but it's not up to us to think about who would be the leader of that Palestinian
Never
state.
in the
You should not
past
objectively assess
we have
that?
never in the past designated leaders in the guise of such negotiations.
Okay, so I don't think what you're saying exactly adds up here, that you wouldn't assess who would be the leader of this Palestinian state.
For the Palestinians to determine.
But the
we're not
Palestinians
talking-
determined this in the past,
But-
and they determined Hamas would be their leadership.
So-
Polling after polling shows they would choose
The
Hamas as their
PLO
leadership.
is the recognized representative of the Palestinian people. Hamas is an FTO and lies outside of the PLO.
You think the PLO is recognized as the leadership by the Palestinian people?
The Palestinian Authority governs. The PLO is the representative.
You think that's what the Palestinian people
I
believe?
haven't done polling on this recently.
But as the top diplomat over the Middle East, I would expect that
But
you've reviewed this.
the PLO is the entity that did the Oslo Agreement with Israel.
It appears
and-
to me, as my time has expired, I thank you for trying to answer. You have not objectively assessed whether it is wise for America to pursue making a state out of Palestinians, and I suggest you do as the top diplomat over the Middle East.
Thank you very much, Congressman Brian Mast. We now proceed to Ranking Member Dean Phillips for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Leaf, I want to thank you again for your emphasis on, and the State Department's emphasis on the repatriation and reintegration efforts of the ISIS families. I spoke about that in my opening remarks. My bill, the Syrian Detainee and Displaced Persons Act, renewed the position of the ISIS detainee coordinator and directed the development of a strategy on how to address these camps. It became law in the 2024 NDAA, and even in Minnesota. Two half-brothers were reunited with their grandparents and repatriated another family of 10 back to the United States. So I just want to compliment you on that effort. I know some might question, why would we do that for ISIS families? But perhaps you could speak to the why. Why is it important? The work that your team is doing is critical for U.S. national security.
So with regard to this effort on repatriation, and I will say it's an all-hands effort because my colleagues in the Bureau for Counterterrorism also work assiduously on this effort, as does the Bureau for PRM, the Bureau for Population and Migration. So what I would say is the following, that those encampments of El Hol and Rouge are both filled with families, children. More than half of the population is children, and they are the sort of the human leftovers of ISIS, and they suffer as much as anyone at this point. The quest to resettle them in their home countries, whether it's largely Iraq or in Syria, goes precisely to the effort of trying to integrate people back into communities, to make those communities resilient, and to be resilient against a resurgent ISIS, and that goes directly to our national security interests.
Thank you for that affirmation. Ms. Pryor, you spoke of MEPA's People-to-People Partnership for Peace Fund. Try to say that 5 times fast. Can you tell me how you're looking at that since October 7th? Has anything changed? And how has the peace-building community in general responded to these events since?
Thank you for your question. So we were concerned with the conflict. What would happen to MEPA? But as we've worked with the peace-building community, we have been inspired by their reaction. What they see in this, in all their trauma and all their grief and anguish on both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, they have redoubled their commitment to peace. And that's hard in their larger communities. So it is really incumbent upon us to continue our support to them while they try to bring back the idea of peaceful coexistence and rebuild those frayed ties between the two communities. I was very pleased that when we put out our most recent solicitation, that we got nearly 100 applications. And so there's clearly still a commitment and a desire now more than ever to find ways for peaceful coexistence. Thank you.
I hope so. Thank you. Back to you, Secretary Leaf. Many of us are concerned about settler violence in the West Bank. It works against our aspirations for peace. I was encouraged by President Biden's EO imposing sanctions, I think, on 12 individuals. Can you discuss that? Has there been any change whatsoever in that activity? And if so, if you could articulate it.
So this has been a longstanding effort over the last, I would say, at least 2 years, and it culminated after October 7th with what we saw as a very sharp increase in violence on the ground, and an effort to really just push communities off their land over and over again. And obviously destabilizing, clearly harmful for the interests of stability and for the lives of Palestinians in the West Bank, but frankly, it ultimately can be a spark and a flashpoint, and therefore a security issue for Israel. We took action to really go after those who are leading this, and this is an ongoing process. We also engaged forthrightly with senior levels, military and civilian, in the Israeli government to cease the practice of army units escorting settlers, which they were doing at that time. That is largely but not entirely stopped, but we really asked the Israelis to redouble their effort to bring this down. We've seen a decrease, but it is by no means over. And lately, we've seen organized efforts to obstruct critical humanitarian aid going into Gaza.
Yeah. Last quick question. I listened to my colleague, Mr. Mass' comments about the myriad of terrorist organizations ostensibly trying to represent Palestinians. Based on your experience in the region and even recent visits, do you get a sense of aspiration amongst the Palestinian people to select, given the opportunity, to select a government that would want to make peace?
So what we have found and what polling indicated on the eve of October 7th was that those who had to live under Hamas's predations, by and large, rejected Hamas. But they didn't have a vote. Hamas rules by dint of the gun, by force. It is fair to say Palestinians long for a state. Our stance is simple. It's a negotiated state. It's a state that shares the land in a sense with Israel, recognizes Israel, as the PLO did more than 30 years ago.
Thank you. And with that, my time's expired. I yield back.
Thank you much, Ranking Member Dean Phillips. And now I recognize myself, and indeed, I want to thank you for being here. And what a time in history. And we all we need a bipartisan manner to achieve as much as we can. That's why I expressed concern again about Dr. Maj Kamal Mas, and that he was an American, Syrian American, and we have so many people in our country who have family. They could be Yemeni, they can be Lebanese. We know Iraq, Iran. But in Syria, for Assad to murder an American citizen, there must be a response so that Americans can visit with their families safely. And of course, dictatorships have a history of doing this with the murder of Alexei Navalny, the kidnapping of Vladimir Kara-Murza by war criminal Putin. Over and over again, people should have freedom of travel without being kidnapped and murdered. With that in mind, I'm also, Secretary Leaf, so concerned about the regime in Tehran, the dictatorship's oil exports to finance their terrorist puppets, Hamas, Houthi, Hezbollah. Additionally, they use that money to oppress the people of Iran. We know that the vast majority of the people of Iran would want to live in a modern civilization, and the Iranian American community diaspora, the Iranian diaspora around the world, just dream one day for freedom and liberty for the people of Iran. With that in mind, to what extent is the administration working with the European allies to ensure a snapback of all UN sanctions on Iran to be triggered at the Security Council before the remaining restrictions on Iran's nuclear program lapse in 2025?
Congressman, thank you for that laydown of all the issues that, in fact, consume this administration. What I would say about snapback is this is an issue that is discussed diplomatically with our partners. I would default to discussing this in a classified setting as to the various aspects of the nuclear program and how that is affected by snapback or not. But I want to address some of the concerns that you just laid out about Iran's freewheeling efforts to destabilize the region. You're right, it is at a cost as much to the Iranian people as it is to the people of the region. And therefore, we have really bolstered our efforts both across economic, diplomatic, military efforts to drive pressures on that. And as we saw on April 13th and 14th, we had an extraordinary opportunity that was quite successful to bring together regional and European partners to bolster and defend against proxy attacks and attacks directly from Iran against Israel. I think that is, however terrifying that night was for all of us, for Israelis most of all, it was a ready demonstration of an appetite for common action that we didn't see 10 years ago.
Additionally, back to Syria.
Yes.
It really concerns me. The Arab League, much to all of our disappointment, has recognized the Assad dictatorship. I'm hoping that every effort is made for the United States not to reach out to the dictatorship, particularly in light of their use of chemical weapons. And then their use of chemical weapons, now we find out today that war criminal Putin is using chemical weapons against the civilian population of Ukraine. And the parallels keep going, and Putin helped lead the effort of the total destruction of Aleppo, then the total destruction of Mariupol, and now the planned destruction of the second largest city of Ukraine, 1.4 million people in Kharkiv, and using chemical weapons against the defenders there. With that in mind, what effort is being made not to prevent normalization with Assad?
So, look, I'll just remind for the record, this administration has no intentions of normalizing relations with Assad. We have, it is one of the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world, right after Iran, and we continue to look for ways to use new sanction opportunities to increase that pressure. We've been very clear with our Arab and other partners that we see no value in the act of giving Assad re-entry to the Arab League. It has looked like it's pretty formulaic. He does not look like he has garnered the dividends that he hoped to, but we make it very clear with our partners that there is a room, if there is no room for flouting our sanctions, and that pressure ought to be applied by them in addition to us and our European partners on this account.
Well, every effort should be made, and it's just so important to have peace through strength and to sanction the dictatorships around the world so they cannot be unlimited in their conduct of mass murder and slaughter. With that in mind, we now proceed to Congressman Brad Schneider of California. Sherman. Oh, not of Illinois.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. We saw the death of Ibrahim Raisi. Unfortunately, the Security Council decided for a moment of silence in mourning his death. And while we feel for the families of every human being, few have murdered as many thousands of people. I want to talk about some brave Iranians who now face the death penalty for speaking out for a women's women, life, and freedom movement and for democracy in Iran. That includes rapper Tomarj Salehi, who became an outspoken voice of protest. On April 30th, he was sentenced to death by 2 judges, neither of whom have been sanctioned by the United States. And so I hope you'll jot down as one of your items to do to see whether these 2 judges should be sanctioned. Since then, 2 more dissidents, Faudar, sorry for the pronunciation, and Danielle Mohadam have been reportedly arrested for their own protests. Can you commit that the State Department will use all appropriate forums to call for the release of these individuals?
Absolutely.
And I would hope that you would suggest to Linda Thomas Greenfield that at an appropriate time in the Security Council, there be a moment of silence for the families of those who Ibrahim Raisi sentenced to death, 30,000 of them in 1988. The 1,500 murdered in 2019 in Bloody November, and the many others who are victims of his blood-stained hands. As to the Houthi, they have killed men for being gay. They have murdered thousands and put their bodies hanging. They have murdered thousands. They are an illegal terrorist group. But what is also not recognized is that there is a real genocide that has happened in Ethiopia, and there are now 600,000 people are dead. And now food in the Horn of Africa is more costly as a direct result of the Houthi, who are probably killing more today through their actions in driving up the price of food to the point where people can't afford it than events in Gaza. We have occasionally bombed the Houthi to stop them or retaliate for them hitting ships, but bombing is imprecise. Saudi bombing is so imprecise that we get a little angry at it now and then. There's a legitimate government of Yemen. They're asking for defense articles. They're willing to do on the ground what needs to be done to save thousands of lives in Yemen, hundreds of thousands of lives in Yemen, hundreds of thousands of lives for those dependent upon food shipments through the Red Sea. Why are we not providing those defense articles?
Thank you for that set of questions, Congressman. So when the administration came into office, one of the first acts of the president on foreign policy terms was to ask that we set up an envoy in an effort to drive the ongoing war at that time to a close, to a peaceful close, to a truce. That is what we did over the course of 2 years, and we have a de facto truce. However, in the meantime, this and a roadmap to peace, to Yemeni negotiations under UN auspices. Quite frankly, we think the food insecurity would only grow greater. The situation would become more parlous if that war were to resume.
I'm not suggesting a resumption of the war, but if the legitimate government doesn't have defense articles, that will resume the war, as we know that Marib is under possible Houthi attack. So if you're going to prevent the Houthis from expanding this war, peace through strength rather than the idea that because you're for peace, you're against defense articles.
No, I understand what you mean.
I'll point out that we had Blinken, of course, yesterday. He committed that within 30 days he'd get back to us as to whether the popular resistance committees in Gaza should be designated as either foreign terrorist organization or specially designated terrorist organization. And I bring that to your attention because you're the one that's actually going to have to do the work. But this is as you know, Hamas does not act alone. It has sister cousin organizations. Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Islamic Jihad is the best known of those. Second on that list is the Popular Resistance Committees, who are responsible for participating in the massacres of October 7th, but have also killed both American and Israeli civilians. So I hope that you'll get that work done and that we will see them designated. I'll leave it to you as to which of those two designations most apply. And finally, as I pointed out to Secretary Blinken, we want a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia and Israel, but not at the cost of a successful Saudi nuclear program. Saudi has occasionally said they want what Iran has. Well, Iran has the enmity and hostility of the United States. Saudi Arabia, remember that any weapon that was in the Shah's hands, supposedly our friend in 1978, was in the hands of the Ayatollahs in 1979. So I hope that any 1, 2, 3 agreement with Saudi Arabia has the additional protocol for more inspection, prohibits reprocessing, prohibits refinement, and otherwise meets the gold standard, and that gold standard is already exemplified in our agreement with the UAE, our nuclear cooperation agreement with the UAE.
And thank you, Congressman Brad Sherman of California, and we now proceed to Congressman Mike Lawler of New York.
Yesterday, I asked Secretary Blinken if the administration was implementing the SHIP Act and the Iran-China Energy Sanctions Act, which were signed into law as part of the supplemental last month. He said that they've been sanctioning oil tankers involved in the Iranian oil trade, but that's not exactly what the bills do. So, Ms. Leaf, do you plan to implement the SHIP Act sanctions against ports and refineries that process Iranian oil?
Yes.
Have you started that process?
I would have to get a more detailed answer for you, Congressman. I don't know where that process lies. I know that we've sanctioned over 220 persons that are involved in the transshipment of oil
Since the bill took effect,
I don't
or
know.
you're talking about prior to?
up to now.
Up to now. Okay. Well, up to now, Iranian oil sales are up $88 billion since Joe Biden took office. So I would say what you're doing up to now has not been effective. Do you plan to implement the Iran-China Energy Sanctions Act sanctions against Chinese financial institutions in cooperation with other departments?
We will carry out the law, Congressman.
Okay, but to your knowledge, it has not yet started.
I will get back to you on that.
Okay. Last year's NDAA included my bill to create a special envoy position at the State Department to prioritize and expand the Abraham Accords. What steps has the State Department taken thus far since that bill took effect?
We do not have an envoy, and however, that said, we had a whole set of staff working on normalization issues all the way up through October 7th. That work will continue apace when the conditions are right. As you know, we have had a specific set of normalization efforts underway as regards Saudi Arabia. The National Security Advisor just reported out on those discussions between Saudi Arabia and the U.S., and then his briefings to the Israeli government.
Okay, so just to be clear, within the NDAA, there was a provision to create the special envoy for the Abraham Accords. And to date, what has been done to enact that?
We do not have an envoy.
Is there a short list? Is somebody pulling together a list?
Not that I'm aware.
So the administration has no intention of filling this position?
No, I did not say that. I said we do not have an envoy at this time.
So this was signed into law in December. When do you anticipate that this process will get started?
I can't answer that today. I'll be happy to get back to you.
That's disturbing. Ms. Leaf, the ICC is an absolute abomination. Do you agree that the ICC has an anti-Israel bias?
Well, I think we spoke very clearly over the last couple of days about this, that it was a shameful equivalency that was drawn between the acts of Hamas and the Israeli leadership. I think the President and the Secretary have been very clear on this point.
Okay,
I can't answer a larger question about,
do you think there's an anti-Israel bias at the ICC?
not in a position to judge that.
Okay. Do you agree with Senator Schumer that there should be regime change in Israel?
The administration is not fostering regime change anywhere, including in Israel.
So you don't agree with Senator Schumer's
That's
demand that there
is a
be regime
decision
change?
totally for the Israeli people.
Okay. Do you agree with Nancy Pelosi when she said that Benjamin Netanyahu should resign?
That is a decision for the Israeli people.
So you don't agree with Nancy Pelosi?
I do not.
Okay. Is Israel committing a genocide in
No.
Gaza?
No.
The fastest way for a ceasefire to occur would be for Hamas to surrender and release all of the hostages, correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And you agree that Iran and Hamas's stated goal is to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, correct?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Okay. So knowing that, why did the administration withhold weapons to aid Israel despite Congress approving the delivery of these weapons?
So at a time of intense discussions with the Israeli leadership, between the U.S. and Israeli leadership, over the question of a major combat operation in Rafah, where at the time 1.4 million IDPs were crowded into a very congested piece of Gaza, where all the infrastructure for their assistance was located there. At that time, the president made a decision to hit pause on one shipment. so that those discussions could continue, but that those weapons would not be used in such an operation. And these discussions continue. They continue during the National Security Advisor's
But you
recent
agree
visit.
that Hamas uses innocent Palestinians as human shields, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. I yield back.
And again, thank you so much, Congressman Mike Lawler, for your very insightful questions. And now we proceed to Congresswoman Kathy Manning of North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to my friends, Chairman Wilson and Ranking Member Phillips, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. Assistant Secretary Leaf, yesterday I asked Secretary Blinken about the alarming reports that Egypt secretly changed the terms of a ceasefire proposal, a good proposal that Israel had signed off on, which jeopardized the release, the deal to release the hostages. Can you tell us what exactly happened there?
I've seen those reports. I really can't elaborate on them, and I don't really know whether there's anything at all to this.
I hope you will follow up on this because it is extremely disturbing to think that a country that we give billions of dollars to aid every year would change the terms of a ceasefire agreement and jeopardize getting the release of hostages who we are all determined to get back to their loved ones safely. Do you find that recognition of a Palestinian state by Spain and Ireland and Norway and other unilateral steps are effective to help secure the release of the hostages and forge a resolution to the conflict?
So our stance on this is very clear. We support a negotiated solution, a negotiated creation or roadmap to a negotiated Palestinian state. Unilateral recognition doesn't advance anything.
And can you clarify the administration's policy on the Israeli operation in Rafah? Do you believe, I mean, we've now seen what's happening in Rafah. There is the exodus of many, many people from innocent civilians from that situation. How can Hamas be defeated in Rafah how can Hamas be defeated without any operation in Rafah?
No, I think the President and the Secretary and the National Security Advisor, all of us who've had these discussions, have been very clear. It's a question of how an operation is undertaken, under what conditions, setting the conditions for people to safely move, ensuring that there's humanitarian infrastructure for them to move to, and then how to go in is the subject of military to military discussions. And I think our military has given really good advice on going in a targeted way and in a way that really mitigates the risk of civilian harm.
And have the Israelis been open to that advice?
We have seen them adjust over time, and we are watching this very closely, as the National Security Advisor said.
So as we discuss the day after, hopefully when this war concludes, how do you see the willingness of Arab partners to assist with the post-war security and reconstruction, and do you see hopeful signs?
I do. And look, this conflict has engendered tremendous turmoil, public anger across the region at the suffering that has been very visible to everyone, the suffering of civilians who are caught in harm's way in the conflict. But I think the governments that we have been talking to, those with relationships now with Israel and several who do not yet have relationships, they have a deep-going commitment to the same quest that we have, which is an enlarging integration across the region. That means Israel integrated into the region. So I do expect that we have a lot of partners on the other side of this conflict.
As I'm sure you have been doing, I have been following all of the reports about the horrific sexual violence, mutilation, humiliation that was used as a weapon of war by Hamas against Israeli women and girls. And we are deeply concerned about those women who are still being held hostage. And recently a video was released from a Hamas GoPro camera showing how horrific their treatment has been. What levers do you see for getting Sinwar to release those hostages?
So I met with families of those 5 young women on one of my, I think, 8 trips out to the region since October. And it was a wrenching discussion. And I, for one, could not bear to look at that video again. At the end of the day, we have, at the end of a phone line, a guy who many people have termed a psychopath. He's certainly messianic. He certainly thinks he's achieved some place in history, and he has dragged everyone towards a terrible place. But I will assure you that both Egypt and Qatar and a few other countries that have some level of influence, but especially those 2 countries, they have worked relentlessly at this effort. So yes, there is pressure from conditions of the conflict itself. There's pressure, I think, from Gazans who want an end to this conflict. But our 2 partners have put unstinting pressure on Hamas.
Thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Kathy Manning. Again, can you imagine, we're gonna miss, we lose Dean Phillips and Kathy Manning. This is just not good. And so, but we appreciate their service. And then we get, but very talented freshmen in here too. So Congressman Gabe Amo, all the way from Rhode Island.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Assistant Secretary Leaf and Ms. Pryor, for being here today. As we continue to witness the devastation in Gaza and increased instability across the region, it is clear that we need an immediate and lasting ceasefire that surges humanitarian aid into Gaza and releases the hostages that continue to be held by Hamas. As my colleague, Ms. Manning, just stated, we must be prepared for the day after. A long-term plan is essential for Israelis and Palestinians alike to have security and self-determination. And I pray personally that it's a plan where the tragic events on and following October 7th are never repeated. This committee, the State Department, and USAID will play an important role in the ceasefire negotiations and the long-term path to peace. Assistant Secretary Leaf, I just want to hear briefly about how you and leaders at the State Department have elevated the humanitarian imperatives as you've engaged in negotiations and your thinking as it relates to the day after.
Thank you, Congressman. So we have out on the field right now a special envoy, Lise Grande, who has 30-plus years of working in the most dire of humanitarian conditions, places of conflict. And she is out there in Israel now leading our efforts, corralling our efforts, working across the Israeli government, with the Egyptian government, with humanitarian actors, with the Israeli military to really bring everything to bear so that we can have a true surge of humanitarian assistance that's not just episodic, but that is sustained. The conflict is unbelievably complex, and the conditions inside Gaza really pose tremendous challenges to the humanitarian workers. Lise Grande is working hand in glove with all of these parties to see that there are deconfliction mechanisms, that all the pieces are put in place so that the food, that the critical humanitarian assistance gets to those in need. She also has plenty of experience on stabilization efforts. So when you talk about the post-conflict setting, we look at it in three sort of buckets. There is security, there is post-conflict governance, and there is, the recovery and reconstruction piece. You can throw a lot of money at that last piece, but the first 2 pieces are really shaped, first and foremost, as the Secretary has said, apart from the military effort to destroy Hamas's capabilities, giving and allowing an alternative to Hamas's ideology is critical. So you've heard the Secretary, the National Security Advisor, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs speak to the need for Israel itself to have a larger strategic political set of objectives alongside the military campaign. Military campaign will just be, as the military say, continually mowing the grass, but not really achieving that settled conditions in which we will work with our partners to stand up alternatives to Hamas in security, alternatives to Hamas in terms of governance. And to an earlier question, we think we have partners out there. We know we have partners out there, but we're going to need a lot of assistance to get those security and governance pieces elaborated in a way that works for the people of Gaza and that is framed in a larger political context.
On the point of surging humanitarian aid, a topic that I am concerned with, earlier this month, Ms. Pryor, USAID announced additional greater federal funding for ready-to-use therapeutic foods, life-saving treatment for children who are facing acute malnutrition. One of only 2 domestic producers of those ready-to-use therapeutic foods is in my home state of Rhode Island at a nonprofit named Adhesia Nutrition, which stands ready and able to offer this critical assistance to vulnerable civilians in Gaza, particularly the youngest. Ms. Pryor, how are these ready-to-use therapeutic foods getting into Gaza to help children facing malnutrition? And at present, are you able to effectively provide these therapeutic foods to civilians in Gaza?
Thank you, sir. You're right. The RUTFs are incredibly important in an emergency response, especially for children who are suffering from severe food insecurity. The challenge right now is just getting goods in. We've had access, open, closed, depending upon security conditions within. We are not getting nearly enough assistance in. The economic support funds that I oversee don't actually engage in this, but I'm happy to go back to my humanitarian assistance colleagues and get more information about this issue specifically. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pryor, and I think the urgency of the moment is clear, and we need to act accordingly to make sure that we address the hunger that far too many are facing. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Gabe Amo. We now proceed to Congressman Brad Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both witnesses for being here today. I have so many questions. I wish we could dwell on all of them. But I'll start, first of all, associate myself with comments of those who've gone before me, but start at a high end. Is the U.S. committed to our leadership role in the MENA region?
Absolutely.
And expected to stay committed to that for the long term?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Does the budget we're talking about and presented here reflect that priority and what we're trying to achieve?
Yes.
Okay. Those are my easy questions. I was speaking yesterday and I tried to make the point that the best way to ultimately defeat Hamas and PIJ in Gaza, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the militias in Syria and Iraq, and all of which center ultimately at Iran, the best way to do that, the most devastating defeat to these organizations, would be to get on a path to peace for the region. Could both of you somewhat expand on that?
I'd be happy to. It's sort of the issue that's on my mind every day. So look, what I think we saw rather horribly illuminated for the first time was the full range of proxies that have been stood up, created by Iran over 30 plus years, nearly 40 years. This has been a project of Iran's. And we who follow these things were well aware of that. We all are. The countries of the region feel the impact of those proxies on their sovereignty, on their security, stability. But this was a really rather ghastly illumination of the degree to which Iran has weaponized the issue of the unsuccessful quest for Palestinian statehood. So you are absolutely right, Congressman. That is an abiding conviction of this administration, that the best way to take the air out of the balloon, if you will, to take this cause away from these terrible terrorist organizations and from Iran itself, is to get the Palestinians on a pathway to a negotiated state, a state that recognizes Israel, that lives side by side with Israel in peace.
Ms. Pryor, I don't know if you want to add to that at all?
So I think we've made a number of investments over the years to support moderate voices throughout the region. And we can see the benefits of that, whether it's in Libya working with journalists who are calling out misinformation that is often by Russia, or Tunisian civil society who continue to press on the need to get back to democracy. And so I think these are, it's big bang for the buck. It's modest resources that I think over time can have an outsized impact. Thank you.
Thank you. And yesterday, Secretary Blinken was asked a question about, the idea of two states. We were asked earlier about two states, but also, the status of the region before October 7th versus after October 7th. And I think the question was put in a way that in September, there was a sense that we were on a good path. We were talking about normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Not everything wasn't addressed, but we were taking steps to make big positive changes. The Abraham Accords, I think, are one of the biggest reflection of that. I'm proud with my colleagues here. We founded the Abraham Accords Caucus, of which I'm one of the co-chairs. We continue to work on that. Within the Abraham Accords Caucus, we're trying to create a Gaza working group, or we have created a Gaza working group to focus on the need to bring first assistance and aid and security and governance ultimately to Gaza. But in the context of the Abraham Accords, and Tal Becker talks about this idea that both Jews and Arabs belong to the same land. Abraham Accords recognizes that. I'd ask you to expand the idea, objective assessment, if you would, of how important it is to recognize that both Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians belong to this land, and that the path to peace is two states.
So I think, it's indisputable that this status quo does not work for the status quo being 5 million Palestinians to the east and to the west of Israel in a state of everything ranging from unhappiness to frustration to rage to despair to militancy. It's a terrible recipe for militancy, for radicalization. And Israel sits squarely between these communities and against a backdrop of a longstanding longing for a state of their own. So, objectively, I can't see any other alternative. The status quo is terrible, and it's been weaponized by Iran in the most malign fashion. And it radicalizes people. On the other hand, you have a set of states, those who had longstanding relations with Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, those newcomers, or those who resumed, Morocco, but Bahrain, UAE, they retain the avid desire not just to keep up the relationship, but to deepen it, to expand it, and to see other people join that community, other states join that community. And that is the work that we are continuing to sort of keep the burners on. And with specific regard to Saudi Arabia, as I said earlier, that is a specific opportunity that we would like to leverage. It will need to be on the other side of this conflict, but I think the other side of this conflict opens up a lot of possibilities.
Thank you, and Chairman, thank you for the extended time. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Brad Snyder of Illinois. In cooperation with Ranking Member Dean Phillips, we now will proceed with the second round because what you're doing is so important. In fact, Ms. Pryor, I have always been so impressed by what the United States Agency for International Development has done. I always cherish my visits to Afghanistan to see the clasped hands of the U.S. and Afghan flags with a arrow leading to a school. And I'd like to point out that at that time, the sign was rusty. The significance of that meant the people liked it there because it would have been very easy to take down. And then to see little girls going to school with white scarves and little guys going to school with baseball caps, which are not indigenous to Afghanistan. And it's so sad now to know that so much of that is being reversed. But it was such a great effort. And additionally, I visited Syrian refugee camps. And gosh, what a positive experience to see how well organized. And these were half TEUs. This was not a tent. People had actually put a real effort into creating a society to see young people again going to schools, even seeing a business area being set up, small businesses, a commercial enterprise, revealing how capable the people are. But a concern I have has been the Gaza pier. It's $320 million to me. That is so irresponsible for the American taxpayers to spend that much money and then find out that the aid that's being transported is being diverted, not to the people of Gaza. And so what efforts are being made to make every effort that whatever aid there in Gaza goes to the people who need it most and not Hamas?
Thank you. Yes, we share that concern. The pier is intended to be another way to expand humanitarian assistance delivery, but really, it's no substitute for the land access, no substitute. Yes, we did have a concerning incident yesterday in which some of the assistance that came off of the pier was desperate people taking it for themselves. However, I am happy to say we have been able to confirm that 2/3 of it is managed to make it through for formal, proper distribution. We are currently working with the UN and the Israelis to see what it is that we can collectively do to prevent this. I'm afraid the breakdown of social order in Gaza has been challenging, and the answer to keep desperate populations from just taking the aid off of the trucks is to flood aid into Gaza, so there's no reason to. Thank you.
Well, whatever effort could be made. And of course, to me, an overriding concern, Madam Secretary, is the potential of a nuclear Iran. I'm just so concerned that the destabilization that will occur with our great allies of the region, and even more, the existential threat to the people of Israel, existential to the people of the United States. They're developing ICBMs for a single reason. It's not for the weather research. It's to ultimately fulfill their dream of death to Israel, death to America. So what is being done to block in every way the stockpiling of highly enriched uranium? What's being done? Because this is existential for all of us.
I absolutely agree with you, Congressman. And, you know, I don't have to repeat, but I'll just say, since 2018, when we withdrew from the JCPOA, we really lost eyes on in many ways and lost the restraints that were otherwise there on Iran. Iran has not shown a particular appetite or seriousness about nuclear diplomacy, as we call it, but we are, the president remains committed to seeing that Iran never has a nuclear weapon. So we are using all the tools at our disposal, and we're working with multilaterally as well as bilaterally on sanctions and disruption activities. And on the one hand, we've seen the steady accretion of fissile material. We have not yet, but we watch very closely, seen steps taken that would move towards weaponization of that. But that is an overriding concern for the administration.
Well, every effort must be made because a nuclear Iran, to me, is with their view of Armageddon, and it's just got to be addressed. And I wish you well, but the duplicity of the JCPOA, they had no intent. That was a delaying tactic. So with that, we again need to be working together and showing that we do. I now recognize Congressman Ranking Member Dean Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Pryor, I want to ask about both Tunisia and Lebanon, starting with Tunisia. The zeroing out of the development assistance account is troubling. Administrator Powers, in her recent testimony to Congress, indicated the same as it relates to investing and protecting rights and democracy in Tunisia. So I welcome your thoughts on that and how we can continue to do so if we are eliminating that budget.
Thank you. So the decrease in Tunisia's budget is very much a reflection of the democratic backsliding in the country and the hard choices we have to make across the region about where we invest our funds. However, we are preserving within the budget the same percentage of assistance for civil society as we have in the past. Civil society is key to holding the president of Tunisia accountable in pushing back on the democratic backsliding. And so our commitment to those organizations remains.
Can you give a little bit more detailed example of how that works and how those dollars are used to that end?
So, for example, we had a youth training program on leadership, and six of our participants ran for the legislature, and 3 of them were elected. So we now have a small foothold of moderate voices going into Tunisia's deliberative bodies.
It goes without saying, and I'm sure you would concur, it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg. If we withdraw resources because of the backsliding, how can we reduce the backsliding? So I still find that troublesome, I have to say. Lebanon, we're all aware of the political and economic crisis. Administrator Powers, of course, spoke about the mass displacement of civilians along the Lebanese-Israel border. Can you speak to ways that USAID is trying to address this other humanitarian issue that is not getting nearly the attention that I think it needs?
Yes, I mean, Lebanon has been just racked by a terrible economic crisis that the World Bank calls one of the worst in 150 years. Just to begin with, going into the current conflict in the region, but Hezbollah's attacks on Israel has now spawned another humanitarian crisis in the south of Lebanon. Approximately 93,000 Lebanese have been displaced as a result of Hezbollah's actions, and they have lost their livelihoods. Their children are losing out on education, and so our budget requests ask for a modest increase in Lebanon to help these people rebuild their lives, whether it's the opportunity to return to the communities of origin or if they have to start anew in another community.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Leaf, relative to the livelihood support that has run out now for the LAF and the ISF, I think in December, are there ways that we can be supporting those institutions in Lebanon to provide some degree, a modicum of stability?
Yes, and I mean, part of the way we're doing that, aside from the funding streams, the FMF, we are working assiduously in a couple of directions. One is diplomatic with a set of partners, putting pressure, frankly, on the Lebanese parliament, the Lebanese political chieftains to do their job, which is to elect a new president that will set up an empowered cabinet and a prime minister. And on the other hand, my colleague Amos Hochstein continues his work side by side with our ambassador, Lisa Johnson in Beirut, to do the backdoor sort of de-escalation efforts between Israel and Hezbollah. And at the point when we move to a ceasefire, his work will begin in a proper formal way. And we are looking at that point through that process. We would look at a more bolstered effort for the LAF, but coupled with the border demarcation work.
Okay, all right. On that subject, is there a chance, do you think, of a permanent border demarcation agreement?
Hope springs eternal. That's
Okay.
what we're aiming for.
Good. And then lastly, another refugee crisis, of course, the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and I think a scapegoat for their economic challenges and whatnot. What are we doing to support them specifically?
Of course, we do a lot of work through our humanitarian funding across the region. We have demands in every direction. We are also redoubling our efforts with the Lebanese government not to target them, not to do anything that would look like refoulement, but
Okay.
to allow them access to the same funds.
Thank you. And
that they
quickly,
deserve.
Ms. Pryor, anything USAID on that subject of Syrian refugees, quickly?
Yes, on our side, in addition to providing humanitarian assistance, one way which we do is using electronic vouchers. So Syrian refugees pump money into the Lebanese economy. But on the development side, what we have done is we work with the Lebanese communities that are hosting these refugees to reduce the toll on the communities. So for example, we have helped these communities expand schools to accommodate Syrian refugee children. We've helped communities improve their water pumping stations and wastewater treatment to accommodate the extra pressures that the refugees are putting on this critical infrastructure, so that this way the Lebanese don't also suffer along with the Syrian refugees.
Thank you both, and I yield back.
And thank you very much, Congressman Phillips. And I want to commend you, Ms. Pryor. The voucher system really works. That's very creative. And to address, again, in Syria, the thought that half of the population, 14 million people, due to the Assad dictatorship, have lost their homes, businesses, their mosque, their church. But thank goodness we've got good people like Kathy Manning now who are try to get things back on track.
I assume you're turning it over to me, Mr. Chairman? Thank you, I appreciate that. Actually, well, let's stick with Syria and Lebanon for just a minute. You have described a really terrible situation in Lebanon, which we are all aware of, and it's because of Hezbollah, it's because of Iran, it's because of all the refugees that have been forced out of their homes in Syria because of Assad. What if anything, can be done with regard to Lebanon? Is there any chance of pushing Hezbollah out?
Honestly, not at this time. There's no institution, there's no element of society that can come up against Hezbollah. But I think one thing that may have been missing from your litany, Congresswoman, is the responsibility of Lebanon's own politicians to put their house in order. That's where the work begins, to put a fully empowered government in place that will undertake critical economic reforms that will raise the country from its dire state. They're in a gridlock of their own devising. And so, yes, they lose control over anything, including the degree to which Hezbollah drags Lebanon into a war.
Well, that makes me think about the innocent Palestinian people in Gaza who have not been able to create any kind of a responsible government. When you think about all of the 400 miles of underground tunnels, sophisticated tunnels, and all the building equipment that went into those tunnels to be used for a war, rather than that equipment could have been used to build houses and schools and businesses. Why have the people in Gaza been unable to get rid of Hamas?
I think it's, if you look at footage of the events back in 2006, 2007, people were being thrown off off rooftops. It
By
was
Hamas.
By Hamas, and those were other Palestinian political elements, Fatah and others. It's been a reign of terror, and it's been a very closed off piece of territory. So it's not surprising in a sense. I want to see at the end of this conflict, on the other side of it, the opportunity for Palestinians of Gaza really to enjoy the fruits of selecting their own leadership and running their own affairs.
So let me ask you about UNRWA, because I question whether the underlying mandate of UNRWA, which has been only to assist the refugees, not to help them build new lives, not to resettle them, whether that underlying mandate has been a fundamental problem that has perhaps prolonged the conflict. As we know, the mandate of the UN High Commission on Refugees has a much broader mandate. That mandate is actually not just to care for the refugees, but to help them build new lives. And we also know not only that is UNRWA probably the largest employer in Gaza, but UNRWA employees participated in the horrendous and grotesque October 7th attack. What should happen with UNRWA when this conflict is over?
So look, I think there are a number of important investigations that will lay out the course of reform that UNRWA should undertake, that the UN should ensure that it undertake. The question of the mandate, I think, obviously is something for the UN General Assembly. It's not something that's going to be solved by member states at this point. I think the functions that UNRWA has had, the core functions it's had in Gaza in particular, there simply hasn't been another organization that has done those, taken up those functions.
But has the notion that UNRWA is to provide not only food but schooling for the Palestinians removed that fundamental governmental obligation from Hamas?
No, I think, I think what occurred in the events of 2007 and what's been the reality since is you've had a terrorist organization running that strip of land, and nobody could contest that. Not the people, not an organization. On the other hand, to your question about where do we go from here, we have to remember also that UNRWA has these critical functions in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and on the West Bank. And again, we don't have another organization that can do that. And the government of Jordan cannot take on all of those obligations, nor Syria, nor Lebanon. In any case, I think the question of settling the larger question of refugees and in every country really comes back to a political process. And that's the answer.
Well, I want to thank you both for all of your hard work and your service. And let me close by saying, I sure wish we were seeing protests against Hamas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Kathy Manning. We now proceed for our final but very distinguished member, Congressman Brad Snyder of Illinois.
Thank you, Chairman. And just to get some things on the record in talking about Gaza, since President Biden spoke to Congress 2 months ago, has Israel sought to surge aid into Gaza?
I'm sorry, did you say
Has Israel sought to surge more aid into Gaza since President Biden spoke to Congress 2 months ago?
Yes.
And is Israel working with the U.S. and others to deconflict distribution of aid within the Gaza Strip?
I'm going to let Jeannie add to my answer, but the deconfliction mechanism is inadequate at this time.
Yes, we continue to work with the Israeli government on improving deconfliction and trying to introduce best practices from other conflict environments, but a lot of work remains to be done.
Thank you. Is Hamas intentionally seeking to disrupt aid coming into Gaza and getting throughout Gaza?
It's seeking to control it where it can, and that is there's also a high degree of lawlessness, but Hamas is an actor in that.
Okay. Let me shift gears and talk to, I like the term you used, the other side of the conflict. Is any progress being made on ensuring Hamas isn't able to return to control of Gaza after the conflict?
It's an ongoing effort.
Okay. And in discussing, there's been talk about a multinational force in Gaza, countries in the region calling on the U.S. to actually put boots on the ground. Is there discussion of U.S. troops on the ground in Gaza?
The President has made clear that he has no intention of having U.S. forces in Gaza.
Okay. And again, for you, Ambassador Leaf, can you talk about your bureau, the NEA's role in planning for the day after Gaza and a better future for all people in the Middle East?
So in addition to the terrific staff that I am privileged to lead in the Bureau, I have a set of staff dedicated to this proposition and drawn from different sectors with different experience. I also rely on several of our chiefs of mission in the field now who have extensive experience on Israel-Palestinian matters. So we work on this on a daily basis, and it is that team helps provide thinking and direction for the Secretary's own engagements.
Thank you. Within the context of looking at the future for the region, and I asked earlier in my first round about U.S. leadership in the region and that commitment, but China is also seeking to play a role, a competitive role. Can you talk about how you are advocating within state and whether S&P or other forums to make sure that we have a comprehensive long-term strategy for the broader MENA region vis-a-vis what's going on in the world with China and Russia?
Couple of things about process. Of course, we're very fortunate to have the expertise at the top of our leadership in the Deputy Secretary, Kurt Campbell. We also have China House. We have personnel overseas, including in my region, who are dedicated to the work of looking at China's engagements, activities, whether it's in the information space, economic, military, what have you. So we have a rich sort of architecture for working on these issues. But let me just draw a contrast, if I could, in how the U.S. leads in the region versus what China is doing. On the fundamental existential issues that confront the region, Gaza, Red Sea security, attacks by Iran and its proxies, you will see the U.S. leading in all of those domains. Whether on the hostage negotiations, on the relief effort for Gazan civilians, whether it's on questions that relate to the Palestinians in general, you see the U.S. leading on that. China has large and growing economic relations. China has been missing in action on Red Sea security, absolutely missing in action. And it's been missing in action on all the other fundamental critical pieces that relate to the security and stability of this region, whether it's, and it has relations with Iran, but it does not appear to use that relationship to any purpose when it comes to constraining Iran and its use of its proxies, whether against Israel or against anyone else. And by the way, I'm not aware that the PRC has ever condemned October 7th.
Thank you. And lastly, as we finish, start where we began, the hostages. There are 128 hostages still in Gaza, including 8 Americans. We know that more than 30 are deceased. We assume 5 of the Americans are still alive. We've already mentioned it, but I want to emphasize the urgency of rescuing these hostages and doing everything we can to rescue all the hostages, including the American 8. There's reports of ongoing sexual violence. There was a video released yesterday that showed the capture of 5 of these women, and with permission of the chairman, I'd like to be able to show that video now.
Absolutely. Without objection.
Thank you. I don't know if we can get the volume. Since there's no volume, I will narrate, but this is a video of Hamas terrorists on October 7th. This is video taken from the cameras of Hamas found in Gaza by the IDF as they were operating in Gaza. These are 5 women soldiers. The video has been edited because they're not showing the many dead bodies that are included in this film. It's taken over a period of 2 hours. And what's heard or being shown in the words is the terrorists talking to these women. At one point, it's overheard one of the terrorists saying, these are our prisoners, we can't impregnate. These women are still being held in Gaza. I think you can imagine the importance of bringing them home. You see in this video horrific images of bloodied prisoners, clearly who have been beaten by their attackers. You see, he's saying, "You are so beautiful" to one of the women. What the terrorist is saying that. Yeah, so the video shows the capture of hostages, an absolute war crime against humanity. These women are still being held. We assume they're being physically abused, sexually abused. I had the privilege of seeing Sheryl Sandberg's movie, Silence After Screams. Sexual violence should be condemned anywhere. It is unfortunate that in this case, not only is it being ignored, it's being denied. I think you can see from these pictures. I hope we do everything we can to get all these hostages home as soon as possible, including the American aid. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Snyder. And it just can't be understated, the horror, the barbarism, the inhumanity of persons on Captagon on amphetamines who actually videoed what they were doing of the mass slaughter and the sexual attacks on women on October 7th. And truly, Madam Secretary, we're talking about people of Israel, but also American citizens. 35 were murdered, and another 6 that we, I believe, have identified as being captive. With that in mind, I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony. I want to thank the dedicated staff of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. Pursuant to the committee rules, all members have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to length limitations. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.